Hello and welcome to APAC Games Weekly episode 55. I am your host, Connell Suter, and on the show we'll do the same thing we do every week, try to take over the... I'm joking, so I've been watching some Pinky in the Brain this week, if you remember how good that show was. What we'll actually be doing is the same thing we do every week, covering the biggest games headlines from the past week from across the APAC games industries. Today we've got a bunch of stories to cover. We'll chat about Unicorn Overlord, quite a name, literally running out of copies in Japan, Nintendo's new Mario announcement, how Japanese retro game stores are making their own consoles, and a couple of other stories to finish off the episode. So, to kick off, let's chat about how Japan is managing to sell out of a kind of weirdly titled game. Unicorn Overlord sells so well that Japan is running out of copies. So if you're like me, you've probably never heard of Unicorn Overlord or its developer, with perhaps the most generic name I've ever seen, Vanillaware. I'm really ragging on the naming of this company and the game, but it is funny. Unicorn Overlord by Vanillaware sounds like a fake game in a movie, you know? But anyway, this game actually has quite an interesting story behind it. Vanillaware's games supposedly actually have a very strong cult following, but they've never really got to a point of true commercial success. It's actually so bad that with Unicorn Overlord, they actually ran out of funds while developing the game and had to finish it with money out of their own pockets, according to a report by Gaming Bolt, which is pretty crazy. Fascinating stuff. However, it seems like that investment has paid off, as Atlus, who are publishing the game, have announced shortages of copies at retailers as it's selling out so quickly. Many of the people talking about this in Japan have even said that they've never really heard of other games selling out in copies. It's pretty crazy. Of course, that's probably a little bit of they weren't expecting it to be so successful, so it's not got as many copies as major titles, but still pretty nuts. This also, of course, goes hand in hand with Japan's love of physical media that we'll talk about a little bit later in the show as well. Anywhere else, it would just be a digital purchase, but obviously in Japan, people love playing it. It's out on the Switch. People still definitely buy Switch games as hard copies as opposed to just software, so it's kind of a perfect storm to create it, but it's great news for them, and you know, the stories writing about it help promote the game, so it's good stuff. Nintendo announces new Super Mario movie. So, to absolutely no one's surprise, Nintendo has greenlit another Super Mario movie. They'll be making it with the same company that made the first movie, who are also generically called Illumination. Unfortunately, the news does say that fans will have to wait a little while, as the release date is actually planned for April 3rd, 2026. At least that's in the US. Obviously, international release dates will probably vary. The film will be co-financed by Universal and Nintendo and will be distributed theatrically by Universal, which I'm pretty sure was the exact same setup for the first Mario movie, which I still haven't seen. I feel like a bad gamer. But yeah, this is cool news. Obviously, I'm not that bothered, as I say, not seeing the first one, but people are obviously very excited about it, which is great. What is a bit of a shame is the 2-year build-up, but of course that does give time for the movie to get good, obviously, but also perhaps a game to be developed. There obviously wasn't a tie-in from, as far as I know, with a full title to the first Mario movie, but perhaps that's something they'd look at doing this time. It's possible they just didn't know how successful it would be, and obviously it was so successful that it feels like money left on the table to not include something like that. But who knows? Obviously, it's 2 years of waiting to find out. Japan's second-hand stores are making their own Famiclones to cope with retro demand. So, last year, we talked a couple of times about Japan's surge in retro games popularity. It's always had a bit of a following in the country, and of course retro fans from around the world know of Japan as the place to go and find amazing deals and rare titles in all of its second-hand shops I remember when I was listening to podcasts back in the mid-2000s and they were talking about organizing raids to fly from America to Japan with empty suitcases to fill them with games and take them back to the US. Pretty crazy stuff, and it still kind of goes on because it's such a lucrative market there for it. That popularity has continued to grow, and so much so that they keep running out of these Famicom-compatible hardware console-ish bundles that the games can run on. The shop Geo, who is one of the biggest second-hand games, CD and DVD sellers in Japan, developed and released a retro game computer console, which was only 2,178 yen, which is just about 15 USD, which is amazing to think you can sell it for that little. They actually sold out almost instantly and ran out by October. Since then, Geo have actually gone on to confirm that they're going to sell that as a standard product in their stores, which really says how popular they are and how much of a future they see in these consoles. They have a competing second-hand shop as well, who's called Book Off, who also launched a console called the 8-bit Compact V2. That was in December and was priced at 3,980 yen, or about $27, so approaching double the cost of the retro game computer by Geo. Bookoff actually have said on this exact topic that their sales of retro games, and specifically looking at Famicom and Super Famicom as well, increased by nearly 60% in 2023. Why? I don't really understand why Famicom games are doing so well. It's fascinating. It's not, there's nothing wrong with these games, but it's, yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Generationally, it doesn't really make sense either, because one of the things you see in a lot of the reports is that it's actually young people who are discovering all this stuff they love and going to it. So it's not a nostalgia thing, at least not for a time that they even lived in. Yeah, very weird and interesting. And actually, one other interesting note, and worth remembering, is that these Famiclone consoles, as they're called, have been around actually since the 80s, so over like 40 years at this point. So it's kind of crazy that companies now are having to develop their own because it's so popular. Again, really, really fascinating stuff, and one of these stories that really only comes from Japan. Love it. Now, away from Japan, Tencent takes over 2 of ByteDance's games. So we talked about this actually in January, that there were plans for somebody to buy ByteDance's games, and Tencent were one of the front runners, at least being suggested at the time. This was after ByteDance announced in 2022 actually that they were going to be moving away from games and would be looking to kind of slowly close down a lot of their games production teams and groups. It's worth remembering as well that ByteDance are the people behind TikTok, so they wanted to focus more on the success that they're doing there. So now it's came to light that 2 of these teams have been purchased by Tencent. These are one based in Shenzhen, who are working on an action game, supposedly, and another who are based in East China, that's all the information we have, who are developing an anime game. As you can tell, there's a real lack of clarity around almost all of this, and it seems that many of the attempts from major publications who are reporting on this, who have asked for comment either from the company or teams acquired or from Tencent, have had no response and just don't really know more about what's happening. It's quite a strange one. This was from Reuters as well, who were some of the first people to report on it in January. So they're clearly invested in the story, and a very reputable publication, so a strange one to not be able to hear anything back from it. The only other detail that we do have is that despite the fact that these teams are quite far apart, it sounds, geographically, they have formed a single company called Saluosi, who is within the Tencent family of companies somehow. This is from a company database in China. I believe they're like owned by an investment company that's part of Tencent. It's an interesting one, and obviously like interesting to see what games that they come out with, and probably to find out why there's this weird level of secrecy at this point. It might just be that there's a lot of things in flux and they're not sure, but it's odd that there's been so little clarity given when asked for comment. And for a final story, 2024 Indie Games Accelerator selects their biggest Asia Pacific cohort yet. So this is some cool news, especially as someone who's a big fan of indie games. Of course, check out Indie Views, which will be returning soon. Keep an eye out. But the 2024 Indie Games Accelerator, also known as IGA, which is a 10-week accelerator focused on helping promising indie games, have selected a huge 25 indie companies from the APAC regions to be involved in the program. That is by far the biggest APAC cohort ever included in the life of the accelerator, and actually the largest single group by region, which is cool. In total, there's 60 companies, so 35 are from all the way around the world outside of APAC. There's actually 8 different APAC countries included, although one difference here is the APAC in the use that is being used in all these reports is the traditional use, meaning it includes India, Pakistan, and even Australia, all who have indies in this program. While of course they are APAC countries by rules as written, it's not regions that we typically focus on, really because there's far less of a cultural link when we start talking about the APAC bubble, including Australia. It kind of dilutes the entire thing. So outside of that, there's I think around 20 of those companies are from the APAC regions that we typically cover, really meaning East Asia. But East Asia is super well represented with companies from Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan, and South Korea all making the list. This is obviously amazing to see so many APAC indies in an accelerator, and I can't wait to hear more about the games. Again, this is just a great sign for the indie development scene in Asia to grow even further, especially among some of these somewhat emerging markets like Indonesia and Vietnam. Really cool stuff. And that was it for APAC Games Weekly episode 55. Thank you so much for listening in as always, and I hope it wasn't too annoying listening to me get slightly annoyed about the fact that some of these articles include Australia in APAC, which to me makes absolutely no sense. But I hope you can join us for APAC, excluding Australia, Games Weekly next week on episode 56. Same time, same place, 12 p.m. GMT on Monday. YouTube, Spotify, wherever you would prefer to catch the episode. Until then, though, I hope you have a fantastic week.